My name is Augusto and I am currently a filmmaker, something I am truly passionate about and for which I worked very hard. But before dedicating myself to my great passion, I had several odd jobs to be able to pay my bills and make ends meet. One of them was in a cleaning company. Basically, we would go to different businesses in the city, mostly offices and malls, and give them a good cleaning hand to get them ready for a new day. I remember the pay was pretty decent and the crew I was with was very nice. We were all good friends and colleagues, but we didn't always do the job together. Sometimes we were a team, sometimes I went alone. We also worked in rotating shifts, because the company not only worked during the day, in fact, a large part of our customers required night work. These were mostly office buildings and stores, as these most of the day were in work. So it was not feasible to do cleaning in daylight hours. And the experience that I am going to tell you today happened to me just one day when I had to work alone and in the night shift. This was an office building where I was often sent. I had to work late that day and I really liked the night shifts. There was no traffic to and from work and I could do my work quietly without interruption, and once I was done I could just leave without any hassle. It's not something I would have wanted to do forever, obviously, but for a while it was fine and I actually liked it, especially since it wasn't exactly a very demanding job, either physically or mentally, and it paid the bills. But moving on with the story, the building was not huge, but it had 3 floors, and when I arrived, I was basically the only living being in the whole place. The routine was simple. I had a to-do list: vacuuming, cleaning the bathrooms, disinfecting some areas. In total, about 2 hours of work. That day, as always, when it was my turn in this building, I was given the keys, and when I arrived, I found all the lights off. I started on the 2nd floor, doing my routine tasks, and after finishing, I went up to the 2nd floor. I had been on the 2nd floor for about 20 minutes, vacuuming, when I thought I heard the sound of the elevator. I stopped the vacuum cleaner for a moment to listen better, and indeed the elevator was moving, going up to the 3rd floor. This puzzled me a bit because I was sure there must not be anyone else in the building besides me. What would anyone be doing there at that hour? If there was supposed to be someone, I would have been told. I didn't want to give it too much thought and went on with the cleaning, forgetting a bit about it. When I finished vacuuming, started with the bathrooms and went outside to clean a window in one of the offices, I heard a noise upstairs. My heart raced instantly and I tried to calm down, but I couldn't. I didn't know where the noise was coming from. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, but I couldn't stop thinking about those noises I was hearing and kept cleaning. But every creaking sound made my hair stand on end. In the end, curiosity won out over fear. I decided to go and see what was going on. I walked towards the place where the noises were coming from. At first I saw nothing, but suddenly the noise came again, louder and closer than before. A man ran out from behind a wall and into the stairwell. I saw him for just a few seconds, but I couldn't get a good look at his face, yet I had the distinct feeling that this person shouldn't be there. How had he gotten in? I had no idea. For an instant, I thought it was some worker who had to work overtime or something, but this person seemed to be hiding, and that really started to scare me. I approached the ladder and opened the door carefully. After all, I didn't know who this guy was, or if he was armed, so better to act cautiously. But when I opened the door, absolute silence. Nothing could be heard. I looked inside trying to see the man, but no one was there. The guy must have been running up or down the stairs at full speed because I didn't think he would have had time to get to another floor, but even so, I had a feeling he was still in there. "Who's in there?" I shouted, but there was no response. Then I shouted again, saying that no one was supposed to be in the building and to leave immediately or I would call the police. Right after I said that, I heard a door open and slam shut on the 2nd floor. Although the man didn't answer me, I assumed he was leaving, which confirmed to me that he was an intruder, and surely upon hearing the phrase, "I'll call the police," he got spooked. I decided to wait a little longer in the stairwell, and after a couple of minutes, I decided to go back to the 2nd floor and continue with my work. It didn't take me too long to finish there. Then I went up to the 3rd floor to clean that level. I went through the same routine as normal as I had done for the previous 2 floors. Everything was quiet. I was going to have to report that someone had been in the building, but I really thought the man had left. Just as I was about to finish with the 3rd floor, I was in one of the corridors when suddenly I heard footsteps. They were coming up behind me. I had absolutely no idea how the man was here, but of course it was him. The footsteps behind me were approaching rapidly, and when they were maybe 20 feet behind me, I turned around and then panic set in. The man was running in my direction with a metal bar in his hand, and clearly his intentions were not friendly. At that moment, adrenaline shot through my body. I started to run and scream for help, but I knew it was very unlikely that anyone could hear me. This was a business area, and hardly anyone would be around at this hour. I ran toward the stairs at full speed, knowing that I had no chance of making it to the elevator, and if this guy caught up with me, I was a dead man. When I got to the stairs, I ran down as fast as I could. I heard the man running down the stairs behind me, and he was now quite close. I turned in an instant to see how close he was and realized that the man was now hot on my heels. Even though I only saw him for a couple of seconds, I was able to detail him the best. The guy had long, sticky hair and a bushy, unkempt beard. Also, his clothes were worn and torn, so I deduced that he was homeless. I continued running down the stairs with my heart drumming in my ears and adrenaline overflowing my veins. I'm not exactly an athletic man, never have been, but with my life on the line, there was no way I was going to let this guy shoot me to death. When I finally got to the second floor and saw the front door, it was like seeing the very gates of heaven. I went through it like a bullet and didn't stop until I got to my car, jumped in, started it up, and immediately went in reverse with a loud screech of tires. Then I could see the guy standing in front of the building with the big metal bar in his hand, but a couple of seconds later he threw it aside and ran out the back of the building. Although this time I was sure the guy was gone, there was no way he was going back into the building. I drove to the 24-hour store a few blocks away, parked there, and called the police, notifying them of what had just happened. They arrived a few minutes later and I drove them to the building. They searched all over the place, but as expected, they found no one. The guy had already disappeared. That same night I notified my superiors what had happened, and they notified the owners of the building. Fortunately, this incident did not happen again, and I did not have to go back, because by the time this madman began to chase me with what I now know was a large metal pipe, as it was lying in the entrance when I arrived with the police, I had practically finished my work. This was a very frightening experience. However, I continued to work at the company for another year, but I never wanted to go back to that building. I still dread to think what would have happened if I hadn't realized that this guy was coming after me, or if he had managed to catch me. I worked in a nursing home for over 5 years. I really loved working there. It was stressful at times and I really hated changing bedpans, but for the most part my job was pretty fun. I had a really nice relationship with the elderly, especially the old ladies. Here they called me Rojito because I have red hair, and most of them treated me like I was their grandson, so you can imagine how they spoiled me. Unfortunately, the center was understaffed, as not everyone likes this kind of work, and because of budget issues the salaries were not the best either. For this reason, I had to work the night shift 3 days a week as well. I hated the night shift more than anything else. I would rather shift 100 beds than have to spend all night in that place. But this had nothing to do with the elderly or the work, but with the fact that they kept all the lights off, except for a single lamp at the front desk, and all I had to do was sit there all night, check the rooms every hour, and call an ambulance if there was a medical emergency. It might not seem so bad, other than the sheer boredom of it all, but you don't know how creepy this place was in the dark. I mean, I'm a brave guy, I take care of myself and all, but when I was in the nursing home after hours and in that gloom, I felt like I was 6 years old again. The building was over 100 years old, so it was constantly creaking and settling, and because we were surrounded by a wooded area, I would always see silhouettes of animals walking outside through the windows. They were always out there, slithering in the dark. Despite my nerves, I never really had a problem during the night shift until one fall day when I was about 3 years old working there. It was Friday then, and I was called in at the last minute because my coworker Edgard had just been fired for stealing meds. Things were normal at first. All the residents had taken their meds and gone to bed. I was at the front desk, checking my phone, when suddenly I heard a door slam. This startled me, so I ran to see what was going on. That's when I saw Vilma, one of our residents, standing in the hallway and looking somewhere. She was trembling and her eyes were wide open. I approached her slowly, afraid that she might hurt herself, asked her what was wrong, and she mumbled, "He's outside. He's behind us." If this had happened during the day, I would have assumed that Vilma was just having some episode related to senile dementia. But this was the night shift, and hearing those words obviously made my heart start pounding in my chest. Both his words and his expression were very frightening, and I really didn't know quite how to act. But I tried to calm myself down and said, "Wait here." As I slowly walked into his room and looked out the window. A clump of trees was just outside. I looked for a few seconds and saw nothing. But suddenly I jumped back as I noticed a figure running into the shadows. That didn't look like an animal. It looked like a person, a man. I quickly closed the latch on the window and then ran back into the hallway. "Okay, I think I saw it," I said to Vilma. "Wait here, okay? I'm going to call the police." I started to head toward the front desk, but she grabbed the back of my shirt and pulled me back. Vilma had never done anything like that before. She was a somewhat eccentric old lady, but she was not violent. "Vilma," I said, "let me get the phone." I looked straight into her face and saw that somehow she looked different from how she looked just a minute before, as if something had changed inside her. With surprising strength, she grabbed my shoulders and spun me around. Before I could do anything, I tried to gently push her away, but she wouldn't stop. I had to push her back, and in doing so, she just laughed like a lunatic. At that moment, I didn't know what to think. Maybe she was indeed having a small psychotic break, an episode of senile dementia, but this was the first time she was displaying behavior like that. I turned and ran down the hallway to call the police, but then more doors opened around me. Angelica, Luciana, and Linda stumbled out of their rooms. They were all dressed in pajamas like Vilma, but their eyes were wide and unhinged. I didn't understand what was going on. It was as if something had driven them all crazy. Linda grabbed my arm tightly. Then I tried to move forward, but Angelica stood in front of me, blocking my way. "Look, it's Rohito," she shouted. Suddenly more doors opened and more old women came out. Then I realized something was really wrong. What had happened to all of them? I tried to go around Angelica, but she kept blocking my way like a soccer player, who was a very large woman and who had always been kind to me, put her arms around me and started caressing me in a strange way, being, "What are you doing, Rohito? Where are you going?" You know, my husband had red hair too. Then he winked at me, like flirting with me. What the hell was going on? I immediately tried to shove her off me by pushing her against the wall and ran back down the hallway, finally managing to get around Angelica and move toward the front desk. It seemed like all the residents were awake now, and more than half the night. They were all stumbling toward each other and toward me. The whole building was filled with their unhinged laughter, and I had no idea what had happened to them. It didn't make sense. It was as if a macabre aura had filled the place and possessed all the elders. Within seconds, I reached the front desk and grabbed my phone. With trembling fingers, I unlocked the screen and called 911. As it rang, I looked around and noticed that more and more seniors kept coming out of their rooms acting just as strange. But at that moment, I also noticed that the door to our medicine cabinet was wide open. Someone else was here. "Hello?" A police dispatcher answered. I told him to send as many people as he could. He asked me about the nature of the emergency, but I didn't know how to explain. None of it made any sense. "There's been an attack," I finally said, and hung up the phone. As the old people continued to laugh, others talking to themselves and others just wandering around. That's when I headed for the medicine cabinet. Whoever was there, maybe they could explain what was going on. As I walked in, I didn't see anyone right away, but I could hear someone inside rummaging through the shelves. "Hello," I said. "Who is in the cabinet?" I asked the dispatcher. The place froze. Then I could see his outline, but he wasn't moving. And then, slowly, he stepped into the light. "Edgard," I whispered. Edgar was dressed in the uniform that of the compound and had traces of dried leaves stuck to his clothes, which suggested to me he must have slipped inside from outside from the forest. He was the figure Vilva saw earlier. He looked at me angrily, and I became alert. "You took it all," he said in a complaining tone. "What do you mean, everything?" I asked, confused. "My personal stash. You took it." "What did you do?" he said as he held up an empty pill bottle. "That's not yours. That's the muscle relaxant he's today to the elderly to make them sleep peacefully." "Edgard," I said slowly, "what are you doing here?" "You got fired." "Yes," he said, "for changing prescriptions. But it wasn't my fault. I just needed to make a little extra money. Plus there were tons of these jars in there. Why did you use precisely mine? You wasted my entire stash. I don't know what the hell was in those vials, but he sure had gotten some in there too. This man was completely crazy. How was I supposed to know that he had slipped God knows what into the old people's pills? But now I was worried about something more important, and that was that I didn't know what the heck it was that I gave them and what effects it might have on the residents. This thought came into my head almost premonitory, for at that very moment I began to hear screams in the hallway. I immediately ran out to the place with Edgard behind me. My nightmare came true. Martin, an elderly diabetic with hypertension problems, was convulsing on the floor. I immediately rushed over to him to prevent him from hurting himself more seriously and saving himself with his own fluids. While holding Martin, I started yelling to Edgar, who was standing like a statue behind me, what the hell was in the vials. But he didn't answer me. Instead, he ran off to the medicine cabinet and then came back with a vial of something and a syringe. Obviously, I asked him what it was, but he didn't tell me either. He just pushed me away and started putting the medicine into Martin. After that, almost immediately, the old man stopped convulsing and started to react. But then it was Vilma's turn. She also fell to the floor with a convulsion, and then 2 more elders. I started to panic, knowing how dangerous this was and that there could probably be a chain reaction due to the I don't know what in the pills. At that point, Edgard handed me the bottle and told me to look in the pantry and get more syringes. So I did, and we began to assist all the elderly who had this reaction. But when we were at it, police sirens started to be heard. Then Edgard looked at me with a mixture of surprise and hatred. "You called the police, you son of a... What the hell did you want me to do?" All the old people were acting like lunatics and had no idea what was going on. Was it me who drugged them? At that moment, Edgard threw down the vial and syringe he was holding and ran out the door trying to escape, but he couldn't even get there because the cops immediately came in and ordered him to put his hands up. One policeman grabbed Dan and handcuffed him. The other officers approached and helped control the crowd of drugged elderly people in the hallway. Finally, the ambulance arrived and the paramedics helped me administer injections with the medication that appeared to be the antidote to counteract the effects of the drug in the pills. Fortunately, there were no fatalities, but from what the paramedics told me, it was really lucky that we had this medicine on hand and used it in time. Edgard, of course, was arrested and jailed, and narrowly escaped a long sentence for manslaughter. When I look back, I think that's just what he thought of when Martin started convulsing, and that's why he wanted to help and keep him from dying, just like the others, because I doubt very much that he did it as a good Samaritan. Fortunately, that was the only unfortunate incident that happened while I was working there, except for the death of one of our grandparents, which is very sad, but something that you end up adapting to when you work in an elderly care place. All this happened when I was about 3 years old working in this place, and I continued working there for 2 more years. But then I was offered a better paying job in another city, and I decided to quit, although it was not easy, because I really got very fond of these grandparents. On my last day, the elders gave me a beautiful farewell, where they thanked me for taking care of them and treating them so well, and then that episode came up. Fortunately, this time we laughed about it, but I knew that it could have ended very badly. Finally, the ambulance arrived and the paramedics helped me administer injections with the medication that appeared to be the antidote to counteract the effects of the drug in the pills. Fortunately, there were no fatalities, but from what the paramedics told me, it was really lucky that we had this medicine on hand and used it in time. Edgard, of course, was arrested and jailed, and narrowly escaped a long sentence for manslaughter. When I look back, I think that's just what he thought of when Martin started convulsing, and that's why he wanted to help and keep him from dying, just like the others. Because I doubt very much that he did it as a good Samaritan. Fortunately, that was the only unfortunate incident that happened while I was working there, except for the death of one of our grandparents, which is very sad, but something that you end up adapting to when you work in an elderly care place. All this happened when I was about 3 years old working in this place, and I continued working there for 2 more years. But then I was offered a better paying job in another city and I decided to quit, although it was not easy, because I really got very fond of these grandparents. On my last day, the elders gave me a beautiful farewell, where they thanked me for taking care of them and treating them so well. And then that episode came up. Fortunately, this time we laughed about it, but I knew that it could have ended very badly. I was working in a liquor store inside a gas station while I was in college. Since I had classes during the day, I logically opted for the night shift. It was a little demanding, but the youth helped. For a long time, there was only one person working at night, and many female colleagues complained about the lack of cameras and that at those hours, every character came in. In fact, one night before I started working there, a woman came in to buy groceries, and when she went out to her car, a man assaulted her at gunpoint. She gave him the money, and luckily the guy let her go. The woman returned to the store crying hysterically, and although the police arrived right away, they never found the assailant. Personally, I preferred to work with someone else even if there were no security issues. The night was much shorter when there was someone to chat with, and the girl I used to close with got along with me very well. In total, there were 4 of us doing the night shift: Oscar, Nico, Diana, and me. Diana had another job and only came in a couple of nights a week to lend a hand to one of the managers. Oscar and I worked together about 3 nights a week, and Nico would join one of us another 2 nights. Diana was a super nice girl and a lot of fun, but she didn't like the work very much. Oscar always got mad at her because she stayed at the cash register while he did everything, but since she only came 1 night a week, we didn't think much of it. Nico, on the other hand, was a case apart. He worked there 5 days a week like Oscar and me, but he was never put with more than 1 person at a time. Nobody seemed to like working with him because Nico was a bit peculiar. One of those people who tell you their whole life as soon as they meet you, spilling a lot of personal details that make you feel uncomfortable. He always complained about the problems in his marriage, apparently. He had had some pretty serious problems with alcohol and drugs, and although he had managed to change drugs for weed, he still didn't control his drinking, and that was very evident. He was also a bit of a pain in the ass, but I guess you get used to all kinds of people in these kinds of jobs. I had been on the job for about 5 months when Nico's stories started to get more intense. All of a sudden, he started telling people that he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia when he was young and had to take a lot of pills to keep from becoming violent. Not exactly what you want to hear from someone you're working with alone in the middle of the night. But hey, everyone has their problems, and sometimes people with mental illness suffer a lot of stigma. I myself have struggled with anxiety and depression, and without medication, well, it's not like I'd be killing anyone, but I'd be in a hospital all the time for sure. So, even though I was a little bit shaky, I tried to reassure him that a lot of people need medication for different problems, and that as long as you take it and are honest with the doctors, there's no reason why you can't do the same as any other ordinary person. When I told him that, he seemed satisfied with my answer, and soon after, the conversation drifted to other topics. For the next week, Nico was especially friendly and kind to me, reminding me daily that he was taking his medication and feeling much better. I responded enthusiastically, but I'm sure everyone, especially Oscar, could tell that I wished he would stop talking to me about it and leave me alone. Oscar had a wife and 2 daughters, ages 12 and 8, so he couldn't help but see us younger girls as his own daughters and think about what they might have to face someday. He also seemed to go out of his way to cut off my conversations with Nico quickly, which I greatly appreciated. Oscar made no effort to hide the fact that he didn't like Nico, and boy, did he have reason to. Nico was getting closer and closer to me, even though this was not something I exactly wanted. But for some reason, he felt too comfortable around me, and when I say too much, I mean too much. It wasn't long before he started telling me details about why he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia, rather than how he was doing on medication. I won't go into detail, because many of those stories were very violent and sexual in content. This obviously made me even more uncomfortable, especially because of the disturbing details. I told him repeatedly that I didn't want to know about those topics, and he acted like he understood, but an hour later, he would bring it up again. When I told Diana about it, she said she would take care of it, and later she talked to her friend, the same manager who had asked her to work there. The manager said there wasn't much she could do, as it seemed I was the only one Nico talked to about such things. The situation was becoming increasingly tense for all of us who worked with him. After the manager spoke with Nico, 2 other co-workers who had worked with him on the night shift also reported inappropriate comments he had made to them. When questioned, I confirmed that my co-workers' statements were very similar to things he had said to me, and after that, Nico received a final warning and was sent home. The next 2 times I saw him, he went on a rant about how the people who had reported him were only doing it because they didn't like him. I assumed he didn't know that I had been interrogated too, and neither Oscar nor I had any intention of telling him. Honestly, we were scared of him, and not for nothing, because this guy was extremely unstable. At one point, he got so angry that he almost started crying, saying that those people were lucky that he was taking his medication, and that if he wasn't, I had no idea what he would do to them. At the time, we didn't take the threat too seriously, and luckily that was the end of it. But as soon as he clocked out, Oscar told him that we had a lot of work that night, and we didn't have time to chat. Nico nodded and left without another word. Oscar wasn't lying. The delivery truck had arrived very late that day, so there was still a lot of stuff to put on the shelves. One thing that previous shifts never seemed to do, unless absolutely necessary, was restock the beverage coolers. It was true that it was easier to do it at night when there were fewer customers, but it was a total pain in the ass because we couldn't stop and chat. But hey, it was part of the adventure, as we used to say jokingly, so we got on with it. I don't remember exactly when Oscar went to refill the drinks, but it must have been quite late, because we had already been working for quite a while. At that point, I was concentrating on restocking the shelves, making sure everything was full. Suddenly, the doorbell rang, indicating that someone had entered the store. "Good evening," I greeted cordially, as I always did when a customer arrived, saying that I was on my way. Normally, at that hour, people just came in for cigarettes or to pay for gas, so I put down my box of goods and headed for the cash registers. He couldn't get through the hole, but he was able to reach the doorknob and open the door from the inside. According to what Oscar told me, because I was on the other side talking to the operator, Nico approached the door, stuck his face to the hole he had just made, and said something that still makes me cry when I remember it. In that same sing-songy, disgusting voice he had used before, he cheerfully said, "I'll cut them into little pieces so small you'll never find them." As harsh as he wanted to sound, Oscar was as scared as I was. He was older than Nico, about 38 years old, but thin and not exactly known for his fighting skills. Still, as soon as Nico opened the door, he lunged at him with his whole body, knocking him back from the impact. Oscar yelled at me to run, and even though I felt like my legs were going to give out on me at any moment, I ran after him towards the back doors of the store. Nico was cursing and yelling at us as we ran, and we were so scared. Oscar crashed hard into the back door, cursing in pain as he realized it wouldn't open. We later found out that Nico had pushed the dumpster against the door, blocking it completely before entering the store. The bastard had it all planned. We both realized at the same time that Nico had planned all this to kill us. He rounded the corner, still walking with those clumsy steps, though faster now, and that gave me some time to slam the backroom door shut and bar it. I sat down in front of the door with Oscar bringing everything he could find to lock it. Nico must have heard my desperate cry, because he started screaming my name, saying that I wasn't the one he wanted, that he would make sure I died before I felt any pain if I opened the door for him. Then he started stabbing at the door with the knife and yelling at me to open it. I started screaming in desperation and pulled away when I saw the knife go through the door for the first time. but Oscar and I struggled to hold it shut. I remember we looked into each other's eyes. We were both crying, and I wanted to say something to comfort him, but the words wouldn't come out. I was terrified too. I had dropped my phone when I ran to close the door, and neither of us could move to get it. We had no idea how long it would take for the police to arrive. The door was wooden, so it wouldn't take much more of Nico's banging and ramming, and if the knife went through the door and hit one of us, all I could think about was that if I was going to die that night, my dog would never know why I didn't come home. I would never graduate or have enough money to start enjoying life. All the future plans my boyfriend and I had made would never come true. It would be the most anticlimactic and horrible ending of all. Suddenly, everything was silent. There were no police sirens, no screams, nothing. It was as if Nico had disappeared. Oscar and I looked at each other, not daring to breathe, trying to listen for any sign of life on the other side of the door. We both turned away from the door when we heard a gunshot, then another, and a third. More silence. Finally, a voice asked, "Is anyone here?" We weren't sure if we should answer, but the voice continued, "My name is Ernest. I'm a policeman. I'm off duty, but I've been listening to the radio. Are you all right?" Oscar got up and moved everything blocking the door out of the way. He opened it just enough to poke his head in and seemed to be out of breath. He opened the door all the way and I ran out into the store. I grabbed my phone and saw that the call had been cut off, or the operator had hung up. When I went back to the back room where Oscar and our rescuer were, he was explaining that the police were sending several cars, but they were all far away, and he had a bad feeling they wouldn't get there in time. The operator had told them what they would find when they arrived. The police officer didn't want any of us to leave until the patrol car arrived, because even though Nico had been shot in the arm, he still had the knife when it was taken away. The officer said he would have chased him, but with the state the store was in, he feared someone was hurt or dying inside, so he preferred to come to our aid. God bless this man. The next 30 minutes were a blur. Oscar and I were sitting on the floor, hugging each other, when the police finally arrived. Ernest had called dispatch and informed them of the new situation, so most of the patrol cars coming toward us were diverted to look for Nico. Soon after, Oscar used his phone to call his wife. She arrived promptly, and he completely broke down as he hugged his wife. I had a similar reaction when I got home and saw my dogs wagging their tails, excited to see me. Nico was found about 2 weeks later in an old trailer I had in the woods. The reason he attacked us was because he thought Oscar wanted him gone so fast, so he could call the owner and get him fired. What we didn't know was that his wife had kicked him out of the house a few days before all this, and was filing a restraining order against him because of the threatening messages and calls he had been receiving. Nico told the police that his job was the only thing he had left and that Oscar should be punished for trying to take it away from him. He said I wasn't the target and that he didn't want to kill me, but he knew he had a better chance of killing Oscar with me there, since he would protect me. Neither Oscar nor I called the owner or any manager about Nico's comments that night, although perhaps we should have. In retrospect, what he said was really disturbing, but we were so used to him being a loudmouth and saying horrible things all the time that we didn't realize he could get serious about hurting someone. I had known him for 5 months because he was already at work when I arrived, and Oscar had known him for a year, and he had never done anything violent. We all thought it was just talk. We also trusted that all employees had passed a background check before being hired. Nico cut a deal with the prosecution. They dropped the 2 attempted murder charges, and in exchange, he would go to a psychiatric hospital for offenders. Neither Oscar nor I were happy with this verdict, but we had to accept it. However, a few months later, I started receiving threatening messages from an unknown number, and the same thing happened to Oscar. We notified the authorities and they agreed to investigate, but no one did anything. In the end, both Oscar and I quit our jobs. I moved to another city and started over there, while Oscar also moved with his family to a rural area where he bought a small country house, both of us hoping that this madman would never find us. But we still live with that latent fear. I never knew anything more about Nico, nor do I want to know. But recently one of our ex-partners told me that Nico had completed his rehabilitation and had been released. This is something I haven't been able to corroborate yet, but I'm terrified just thinking that he's out there and could find us at some point. Working nights at the mall as a cleaner wasn't exactly my ideal job, but at least it paid the bills. We were a small team, just 3 of us. Me, Marta, the boss, a woman in her 40s, and Carlos, a nice guy a few years older than me, who was always telling jokes to make the shift more bearable. Our shift started at 10 p.m. and ended at 6 a.m. We each had our assigned area. Mine was the East Wing, which included the food court and some stores. The routine was the same as always: sweeping, mopping, emptying trash, and leaving the bathrooms sparkling clean. The mall closed at about 7 p.m., and our shift started from there, so there was no one else in the whole place but us, so the silence was almost total, interrupted only by the distant hum of our cleaning machines. It was a bit scary, to be honest. One night, when I had been on the job for about 2 months, I noticed a strange smell in the food court. It was a mixture of stale food and something sour, pretty gross. I followed the trail of the smell to the back of a small smoothie stand in the back that had been closed for several months. As I approached, I looked across cautiously and saw a shadow moving behind the counter. My heart went pitter-patter. "Hey, hello," I called out, with my voice boomed down the deserted hallway. Not a soul answered. I approached carefully and peeked over the counter. To my surprise, I found a pile of dirty clothes and an old sleeping bag. I couldn't believe it. Someone had been living there. I stepped back carefully and then went out like a soul to find Marta and Carlos. I told them what I had seen, and the 3 of us decided to go back together to investigate. When we got to the smoothie stand, the person was gone, but it was clear that someone had been there. We alerted mall security, but they didn't seem too alarmed. They told us they would look into it and to go about our business. A few nights later, I was there, quietly emptying the garbage cans near the food court, when suddenly I felt someone watching me. You know, that uneasy feeling you get when someone is watching you, even if you can't see them. Well, at that moment, that feeling became very intense, and at one point, I could feel the presence of someone behind me. All the hairs on the back of my neck stood up and I slowly turned around. It was then that I found myself face to face with a guy who looked like he had been through hell. Matted hair, glassy eyes, and full of spider's gunk. He gave the impression that he hadn't eaten or slept in days, but also that he was under the effects of something else, since his teeth were clicking as he moved his jaw in a weird way. "Do you need anything?" I asked, trying to sound confident, though inside I was panicking. The man didn't say a word, just took a step toward me, which made me recoil. I then scanned him up and down, and that's when I realized he was holding a rusty knife in his hand. I started backing away slowly, trying to keep my cool, but my heart was pounding a mile a minute. "I'm just cleaning up. I don't want any trouble, just let me go home," I said, hoping he would relax a little, but the guy still had the same unfriendly face and that expression. He kept coming closer and closer, and I felt like I was going to have a heart attack. Seeing that the man had no intention of stopping, I ran to the nearest bathroom and locked myself inside. I leaned against the door, holding my breath as I heard his footsteps approaching, and then he stopped in front of the door. The guy tried to open it, shaking the handle angrily, but it wouldn't open, and then silence. I stood still, trying to hear any noise that would tell me where he was. I felt like my heart was going to burst out of my mouth at any moment. I was completely terrified and didn't know what to do. The fear I felt was so much that my mind was blocked. After what seemed like an eternity, I finally heard his footsteps walking away. I stayed in the bathroom for a while longer, trying to calm down. When I finally came out, the mall was deserted. I had to find Marta and Carlos as soon as possible. I ran through the aisles with 1,000 eyes and crying from sheer nerves until I finally found Marta near the entrance of a store. I hurriedly told her what had happened and she turned white as a sheet, so she called Carlos right away. The 3 of us met in the food court, and Marta decided it was time to call the police. While we waited, we stood together, scared to death. The police arrived about 20 minutes later, took our statements and started searching the mall. We stayed in the security office watching the CCTV footage, looking for any clues about the guy. Suddenly, there he was, hiding in the shadows near one of the stores at the far end of the mall. On the screens, we watched as the cops fanned out through the aisles, but the guy was elusive, disappearing into the maze of stores and maintenance areas of the mall. The tension was palpable in the security office as we followed the chase on the cameras. After more than an hour trying to find the guy, he was finally cornered in a warehouse near the loading docks. There was a brief but intense struggle between the man and the agents, and then it was over. They dragged him out in handcuffs and took him away. After the police left, we tried to return to our duties, but the atmosphere was very charged. I kept feeling the adrenaline in my body, and I couldn't get the image of that guy with the knife out of my head. The following nights were an ordeal. Every shadow, every noise made my hair stand on end. Marta, Carlos, and I hardly talked about what had happened, but fear hung in the air. Later, we learned that the man had been living in the mall for weeks, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. The idea that he had been there all that time, watching us without us noticing, gave me chills. From then on, whenever I worked at night, I felt uneasy, constantly looking over my shoulder. The paranoia I felt every night on my shift became so intense, I ended up quitting a month later. I really couldn't keep working there feeling that way. Since then, I have never worked the night shift again. I work for my dad in his small construction company. He takes care of the warehouse and yard, which is full of materials, and also oversees the construction work. I've been working for him since I was 17. Basically, I'm the go-to guy for everything. I carry materials back and forth, pick up whatever's needed. You know, the typical beginner's job. My father is a tough guy, and he taught me and my brother from an early age that things are earned with hard work. So I never had preferential treatment with me because I was his. I could say I'm the hardest worker in the whole company. But I am not complaining, because I understand that this is an important lesson for my life, and if I am ever going to inherit this company, I must know very well how the work is done. Sometimes, depending on the project, certain materials have to be brought to the site before the workers arrive, so they can start first thing in the morning. So every once in a while during busy weeks, I would have to start work very early, like 2 or 3 a.m., to make sure everything was on time. Obviously, this only happened in the summer, when I didn't have classes, so I had no excuse not to do it. The truth is that I like to make the deliveries early. It was quiet and no one gave me any trouble. However, this changed one day. I arrived at the warehouse at 3 a.m. as usual, loaded up the truck and headed to the job site. It was a repair job on an old, almost abandoned building on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, I saw a pickup truck parked just ahead. The lights were off and there didn't seem to be anyone around. It was too early in the morning for anyone to be working, so I didn't expect to find any vehicles there. I parked and approached the van. It wasn't company-owned and the windows were smoked out, so I couldn't see inside. I turned around and looked toward the building, trying to see if anyone was there. I yelled out asking if anyone was inside, but got no response. I started to feel a little weird. Somehow this gave me a bad feeling. So I pulled out my phone and called my dad, but it went to voicemail. I figured it was probably some worker's truck that had left it there the night before. I didn't want to make a bigger deal out of it after all. Everything seemed to be calm. I went back to my truck and started unloading the materials. It took me about an hour. Then I got in and started to leave. But as I was leaving the construction site area, I looked in my rearview mirror and the lights of the other truck suddenly came on. I slammed on my brakes, pulled off to the side of the road, and watched as the truck started to back up. Someone had been there the whole time. I was sure it couldn't be a worker because they would have answered me when I yelled. I sat there watching as they pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road. I grabbed my phone and redialed my dad's number, and as I waited for him to suddenly answer, I looked up and saw that the van had pulled up right next to me. I stared out the window, aware that someone was watching me from inside. At that moment, it was as if my instinct was telling me, "Get out of there now." I threw the phone on the seat and accelerated forward immediately, but then the van kept up with me, preventing me from getting back on the main road. I had no escape. To my left were trees, and to my right, the van was blocking my path. Panic began to take over and my head felt like an espresso pod as I tried to figure out what to do. So I put it in reverse and tried to back up, but the van did the same. Then I felt them hit the side of my truck, making me lose control completely. I skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. At that moment, the van braked sharply, as if they were going to pull out, but then the brake lights went out and they accelerated at full speed, disappearing completely into the darkness. The crash rendered my van useless, and I took several blows from the impact, so I was dazed and starting to feel very dizzy. Just seconds later, another car braked on the side of the road and a man came running out towards me, asking me if I was okay. I was so shocked at the time that I couldn't remember his name, but I knew he was one of the workers who had just arrived at the construction site. He had only seen the last part of what happened, but he recognized the truck that hit me as that of Samuel, another worker my father had hired a few months ago. It turned out that there were a lot of tools and materials missing from the construction site, almost $10,000 worth, and that was just from that night alone. He could have been stealing bit by bit for months. I think what happened that night was that Samuel thought that if I saw his truck, it would all come down on him and he would get caught. So he tried to stop me. I don't know what he would have done to me, but considering I was the only witness, he probably would have gotten away with it if I had never been seen again. Now I'm sure his intention was to finish me off while I was still inside the van, crashed into the tree, but then he saw this other company van approaching and decided to run away. Unfortunately, his name and everything else led to nothing. It was likely that he was an illegal immigrant or some kind of criminal who had gone to the trouble of forging or stealing identity documents and work permits. I never expected something like this could happen, but at least it is highly unlikely that I will ever see this man again.